The rain fell over Portland the way it always did in late autumn, thin and relentless, turning the streets into ribbons of silver light. Ethan Holloway had not planned to help anyone that evening. He was simply a man walking toward a hotel lobby with a folder of blueprints under his arm when he spotted a woman struggling with a suitcase that seemed far too heavy for her. He did not know her name. He did not know that within the hour the entire hotel staff would believe he was her husband. He did not know that a single moment of silence from her, the moment she chose not to correct a stranger's mistake, would become the beginning of the most talked-about romance in the hospitality industry. All he knew, standing there in the rain, was that a woman needed help, and he was the kind of man who could not walk past that. The wheel of a suitcase had caught on the curb, and the case had toppled sideways into a puddle. She crouched to right it. Her coat soaked through at the shoulders, her dark hair plastered to her cheek, and for a moment she looked nothing like the woman whose photograph appeared in business magazines twice a year. Ethan crossed the street without thinking. He lifted the suitcase before she could protest, tucked his folder under one arm, and offered his free hand to help her up. She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and suspicion. The look of someone who was rarely offered help without an agenda attached to it. He said nothing clever. He only said, "Let me get that for you. It's heavier than it looks." She studied his face for a long second, decided he was harmless, and let him carry it toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby of the Cascade Regent Hotel glowed with warm light, chandeliers throwing gold across polished marble, and the doorman nodded at them both as though they were expected. Ethan intended to set the suitcase down, wish the woman well, and continue on to the architecture conference registration desk across the hall. That was the entire plan. But the front desk clerk, a young woman named Chloe, with a bright practiced smile, looked up and saw two people arriving together, damp from the same rain, hands so close they were almost touching, and she made an assumption that would unravel everything. The woman beside him was Nora Ashford, though nobody in that lobby knew it yet. She was 37 years old, the chief executive of Ashford Hospitality, a company that owned some of the most exclusive hotels on the West Coast, and she had checked in under a private reservation specifically because she did not want to be recognized. Her assistant had booked the room weeks earlier under a false name. A small precaution she used whenever she traveled to inspect a property without warning the staff. She had not expected the elevator to break down on her way in from the parking garage, had not expected to be forced to drag her own luggage through the rain, and had certainly not expected a stranger to appear out of nowhere and treat her like an ordinary person instead of a headline. Chloe glanced at her screen, saw the reservation for two under the name Holloway, then looked back up at Ethan and the woman standing beside him, damp and close and unmistakably paired in her eyes. She smiled warmly and said the words that would change everything. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Holloway. Your suite is ready whenever you'd like to head up." Ethan opened his mouth to explain there had been some mistake. That he was here alone for a conference, that this woman was a stranger he had simply helped with her bags. But before a single word left him, Nora turned to the clerk with a composed, gracious smile and said only, "Thank you." Ethan stared at her. She did not look back at him, and in that instant, without either of them fully understanding why, the lie had already begun. Ethan waited until they were a few steps away from the desk before he leaned toward her, his voice low. "I think there's been some confusion. I'm not your husband. We only just met." Nora kept walking, her chin lifted, her pace unhurried, the picture of a woman who had never once panicked in public. "I know," she said quietly. "Please just walk with me a little further." He noticed then what he had missed in the rain, a man near the revolving doors holding a camera low against his hip, pretending to check his phone, his lens angled just slightly too precisely toward them. Ethan understood without being told that they were being watched. The elevator carried them upward in silence, the floor display counting steadily toward the higher floors, and Nora exhaled the moment the doors slid shut. She turned to him, her composure cracking just enough to show the exhaustion underneath it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to pull you into this. My name is Nora Ashford. I run Ashford Hospitality, and there is a photographer downstairs who has been following me for 3 days trying to catch me alone so he can invent some story about my personal life." Ethan recognized the name instantly, though he had never expected to be standing beside her in an elevator, mistaken for her husband, holding her suitcase like it belonged to him. "Ethan Holloway," he said simply. "I design buildings. Or, I used to." She studied him again. The same measuring look from the sidewalk, Except now there was something softer in it. "If I walk out of this hotel tonight and correct the mistake," she said, "that photographer writes a story about the CEO caught alone with a stranger in a hotel room, and by morning it will have a headline I never wrote and could never take back. But if I let this stand, even for a few days, the story becomes boring. A married couple checking into a hotel is nothing. Nobody chases nothing." Ethan considered this in silence as the elevator slowed. "And what happens to me in that story?" he finally asked. "The man who isn't your husband?" Nora met his eyes, and for the first time. That night, there was something like an apology in her voice. "I was hoping you might be generous enough to find out." The doors opened onto a quiet hallway lined with soft lighting, and neither of them moved for a moment. Ethan thought of the conference downstairs. The badge in his coat pocket with his own name printed on it, the ordinary week he had planned for himself. He thought too of the years since his wife had died, the quiet routines he had built to avoid exactly this kind of unpredictable, complicated moment. And yet something about the steadiness in Nora's eyes, the way she did not beg, only asked, made him set his folder down on the small table by the elevator and say, "A few days. That's all I can promise." Nora nodded once, as though sealing a business agreement, though both of them understood this was nothing like the deal she signed at the office. Behind them, the elevator doors closed, carrying away the version of the evening where they had simply been two strangers who never spoke again. Over breakfast the next morning, Nora laid out the terms with the same precision she used in board meetings, though her voice was quieter, almost careful, as if she understood she was asking for more than a business favor. She told him there would be no physical contact beyond what was necessary to maintain appearances in public. No questions about her private affairs beyond what he needed to know to keep the story consistent, and no lies told that were not absolutely required. Ethan listened without interrupting, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. And when she finished, he asked only one question. "What happens to you if this doesn't work? If someone figures it out?" Nora's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then the board finds a reason to question my judgment. The stock takes a hit, and every man who has ever wanted my position gets a little closer to it." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding for the first time just how much was resting on the quiet lie they had agreed to keep. He asked her too why she had not simply corrected the mistake the moment it happened, back at the front desk before either of them had time to think it through. Nora considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly, "Because for one night, I wanted to walk into a room and not be the only name people whispered about. I wanted someone standing beside me, even if it wasn't real." Ethan did not respond right away. He had built his own version of solitude out of grief, deliberate and guarded, while she had built hers out of power and exposure, and though the two things looked nothing alike from the outside, he recognized something familiar in the loneliness underneath her explanation. "I understand that more than you might think," he said quietly, and left it there, unwilling to explain further before the coffee between them had even gone cold. They agreed on a handful of practical details before the morning ended. Small logistics that would keep the illusion consistent should anyone ask. He would say they met at a mutual friend's dinner 2 years earlier. She would say they had kept the marriage quiet because of how relentlessly the press covered her personal life. Neither of them expected the arrangement to last more than a few days, a week at most, just long enough for the photographer downstairs to lose interest and move on to some other story. Ethan folded his napkin, set it beside his plate, and extended his hand across the table the way he might close a business deal. "A few days," he said again, sealing it. Nora shook his hand, and neither of them let go quite as quickly as the moment required. They spent that first full day walking through the hotel together, Nora posing as a guest, inspecting the property she secretly owned, Ethan at her side, offering the kind of unthinking courtesies most men had long since stopped bothering with. He held doors without announcing that he was holding them. He noticed when she shivered near an open terrace and draped his own jacket over her shoulders before she could ask. He pulled out her chair at the restaurant, not as a performance for the staff watching them, but simply because it was how he had always treated the people he cared about. Nora, who had been courted by executives and investors and men who wanted her company's resources far more than they wanted her company, found herself watching him with a kind of quiet astonishment. Nobody had done these small things for her in years. Not because no one wanted to, but because she had never allowed anyone close enough to try. By evening, word of the mysterious CEO and her husband had already begun spreading beyond the hotel walls. Someone had photographed them crossing the lobby, Ethan's hand resting lightly at the small of her back to guide her past a crowded corner, and the image had travelled quickly through gossip columns eager for anything involving Nora Ashford's personal life. Headlines speculated about a secret wedding, a hidden marriage kept from the public for years, a mystery man finally revealed. Nora read the coverage in her suite that night, her expression unreadable, while Ethan stood by the window, watching the city lights blur through the rain. "This is bigger than I expected," he admitted. Nora set her phone face down on the table. "It always is," she said. "That's exactly why I never let anyone in." The days that followed blurred into something neither of them had anticipated, a rhythm that felt less like a performance and more like an actual life shared between two people. They ate breakfast together each morning without needing to discuss whether they would. Ethan learned that Nora took her coffee black, except on days she had slept poorly, when she added cream without acknowledging why. Nora learned that Ethan always checked the weather before stepping outside, an old habit from carrying his daughter's umbrella years ago, though he never explained the memory attached to it. They toured hotel properties together under the guise of a married couple evaluating renovations, and the staff at each location treated them with the easy warmth reserved for people who clearly belonged to one another. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony reviewing renovation sketches Ethan had made without being asked, Nora noticed how differently he approached a building than the architects her company usually hired. Where others saw square footage and profit margins, he saw the exhausted traveler arriving after a long flight, the child who might one day run down a particular hallway, the widow who might sit alone at a particular window seat and need the light to fall just right. She asked him why he designed that way, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because a building outlives the person who commissions it," he said. "It should be built for whoever needs it most, not whoever paid for it." Nora set down her coffee and looked at him for a long while after that, something in her chest rearranging itself in a way she did not yet have language for. At a charity gala hosted by one of Ashford Hospitality's largest investors, Nora wore a deep emerald gown that drew every eye in the ballroom, and Ethan, in a simple black suit that had not seen use since before his wife passed, stood beside her with a steadiness that seemed to calm the nervous energy she carried into every public event. When an elderly investor asked how long they had been married, Ethan answered without missing a beat. Long enough to know better than to let her carry her own bags. The joke landed perfectly, laughter rippling through the small circle of guests, and Nora laughed along with them genuinely before catching herself and wondering when exactly laughing beside this man had started to feel so effortless. It was near the end of that evening on the terrace overlooking the city that Nora nearly lost her footing on a rain-slick step, her heel catching against the stone edge. Ethan's hand shot out instantly, catching her elbow, pulling her steady against his chest before she could fall. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her hand had landed flat against his lapel. His other arm curved protectively around her back, and the space between them had narrowed to almost nothing. Somewhere near the terrace doors, a photographer who had slipped past security lifted his camera and captured the exact instant their eyes met. An image that would be printed the following morning under a headline suggesting far more intimacy than either of them had intended to reveal. Nora stepped back first, smoothing her dress, her cheeks faintly flushed from something that was not entirely the wine. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan only nodded, though his hand lingered near her arm a moment longer than necessary before he let it fall away. Neither of them spoke of the moment again that night, but both of them carried it back to their separate rooms, turning it over in the quiet, the way people do when something has shifted and they are not yet ready to name it. Curiosity, once it took hold of Nora, was not something she knew how to ignore. And so, 2 nights later, she found herself sitting in her office with her laptop open, searching Ethan's name, the way she might vet any stranger who had suddenly become central to her public life. What she found surprised her more than she expected. Ethan Holloway had once been one of the most celebrated architects on the West Coast, a man whose designs for boutique hotels and cultural centers had earned him recognition in publications she herself subscribed to. His name appeared beside prestigious awards, his early buildings praised for blending warmth into structures that could easily have felt cold and corporate. And then abruptly, 8 years ago, his name simply stopped appearing anywhere at all. She dug further, careful and quiet, the way she handled any due diligence that mattered to her personally rather than professionally, and eventually she found the truth buried in an old obituary. Ethan's wife had died suddenly, an illness that had progressed faster than anyone expected. And in the aftermath, he had closed his prominent firm, stepped away from every major project in progress, and disappeared from the industry that had once celebrated him. He had resurfaced, eventually running a small design studio, the kind of quiet, modest operation that asked nothing of him beyond honest work and no attention. Nora closed her laptop that night with a heaviness in her chest she had not expected, understanding for the first time that the calm, steady man beside her had once carried a grief large enough to make him abandon everything he had built. She thought about the man who had once stood at the podiums of industry award ceremonies, celebrated for buildings that made strangers feel something rare and unnamed the moment they walked through the doors, and she tried to reconcile him with the quiet man who now ran a modest studio out of a converted warehouse near the waterfront, taking on only the projects that moved him rather than the ones that paid the most. She found an old interview, years old, in which a younger Ethan had spoken about designing spaces that made people feel less alone, and she wondered, reading it late into the night, whether he had ever imagined that the philosophy would someday apply to his own life rather than the buildings he created. Her respect for him deepened after that, though she said nothing of what she had learned, unwilling to intrude on something so clearly private. She began noticing him differently, the quiet economy of his movements, the way he never spoke about himself unless directly asked, the careful attention he gave to every small detail of a room or a person, a habit she now understood had once been the foundation of an extraordinary career. When she caught him sketching absent-mindedly on a hotel napkin one morning, an elegant little rendering of the lobby's arched ceiling, she asked to see it, and he slid it toward her almost shyly, as though showing her something he had not shown anyone in years. It was at a business dinner later that week that the past caught up with them both in an unexpected way. A distinguished older man approached their table, his expression lighting with genuine recognition the moment he saw Ethan's face. "Chief," the man said warmly, extending his hand. "I never thought I'd see you at one of these again." Ethan rose to shake his hand, his expression carefully neutral, though something tightened at the corners of his eyes. The man turned. Out to be Walter Brooks, once Ethan's project director on several of his most celebrated designs, now working as a consultant for a rival hospitality group. Nora watched the exchange closely, sensing immediately that this reunion carried weight neither man was fully saying aloud. Walter lingered at their table longer than was comfortable, recounting old projects with the enthusiasm of someone who had clearly missed working alongside Ethan, occasionally glancing toward Nora with open curiosity about the woman who had somehow drawn the reclusive architect back into public view. He mentioned almost in passing the unfinished cultural center Ethan had walked away from 8 years earlier, a project that had sat half-completed for nearly a year before another firm quietly finished it under a different name. Ethan's expression flickered at the mention, something old and painful surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down with the same practice control Nora had come to recognize as his way of surviving grief rather than resolving it. When Walter finally excused himself, Ethan sat back down slowly, his jaw tight, and Nora reached across the table without thinking, resting her hand briefly over his. "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said quietly. Ethan was silent for a moment, staring at the tablecloth before he spoke in a low voice. "I walked away from that project 3 weeks after the funeral," he said. "I couldn't sit in meetings talking about deadlines and materials when I could barely remember to eat. Everyone told me I'd regret it eventually, that the work would have helped me heal. I don't think they understood that some things aren't meant to be healed by staying busy." Nora did not offer platitudes or reassurances. She simply kept her hand over his, letting the silence between them do what words could not. And Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing behind his eyes before he simply said, "Thank you," and let the subject rest there between them, unspoken, but somehow no longer entirely unbearable. Back at Ashford Hospitality's headquarters, the sudden and very public appearance of a husband nobody had known about had not gone unnoticed by the company's leadership. Mitchell Ward, one of the company's most senior vice presidents, had spent years positioning himself as the natural successor should Nora ever step back from her role, and the emergence of a mysterious personal partner threatened the careful narrative he had built around her supposed marriage to her work. In a closed-door meeting with 2 other board members, Mitchell voiced what he framed as concern for the company's stability, but what was underneath something closer to resentment. "We know nothing about this man," he said. "For all we know, he's positioning himself to gain influence over her decisions, her assets, her shares in this company." Mitchell had built his career at Ashford Hospitality through patience rather than brilliance, waiting nearly a decade for a moment when Nora's judgment might appear compromised enough to justify his own advancement, and he was not about to let a stranger with a suitcase undo years of careful positioning without a fight. He framed his concerns to the other board members in the language of fiduciary responsibility, insisting he only wanted to protect shareholder interests, though the two directors seated closest to him exchanged a knowing glance. That suggested they understood his motives went considerably deeper than that. The board authorized a quiet investigation into Ethan's background. The kind of thorough vetting typically reserved for major acquisitions rather than a woman's personal life, though nobody framed it that bluntly in the meeting minutes. Investigators combed through his financial records, his old business filings, any hint of debt or scandal or the kind of ambition that might explain why a man would suddenly attach himself to one of the most powerful women in the hospitality industry. What they found instead unsettled Mitchell far more than any scandal could have. Ethan's finances were, if anything, remarkably modest for a man who had once run a major architecture firm. He had donated millions from the sale of his previous company to grief support organizations and community health centers. He had designed and built entirely without charge 3 community centers in underserved neighborhoods across the state. Projects he had never publicized and had, in fact, actively avoided taking credit for. When the findings reached Nora's desk, she read through them twice, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest as she understood more fully who this man beside her truly was. There was no hidden agenda, no calculated pursuit of her wealth or influence, only a man who had quietly rebuilt purpose for himself out of grief by giving away what he no longer wanted for himself. Mitchell, frustrated by the lack of ammunition the investigation had produced, resorted instead to subtler tactics, planting a quiet rumor among industry contacts that Ethan was simply a clever opportunist who had orchestrated the entire hotel encounter to gain access to Nora's fortune. The rumor spread slowly at first, whispered in boardrooms and industry lunches, gaining just enough traction to make Nora's assistant flag it as a growing concern. Within the week, Nora confronted Mitchell directly during a routine executive meeting, her voice level but unmistakably sharp. "If you have concerns about my personal life affecting this company," she said, "bring them to me directly. Don't send investigators to dig through a private citizen's finances and then spread half-truths about the results when you don't find what you were hoping for." The room fell silent, several board members exchanging uneasy glances. And Mitchell, caught between denial and admission, chose to say nothing at all, though the look he gave her afterward made clear the matter was far from settled in his mind. Nora left the meeting that day more certain than ever that whatever Ethan was to her, whatever this arrangement had become, she was no longer willing to let anyone question his character without consequence. It was Ethan in the end who first suggested the arrangement had run its course. They were sitting on the balcony of her suite one quiet evening, the city spread out beneath them in a haze of amber light, when he set down his glass and said more carefully than he meant to, "I think it's time we ended this. The rumors have done what we needed them to do. Nobody's chasing the honeymoon story anymore. It's safe for you to correct things now, quietly, without it becoming a scandal." Nora did not answer right away. She looked out at the skyline instead, her hands folded in her lap, and something in her chest tightened in a way she did not have a name for yet. "You're probably right," she finally said, though the words felt heavier leaving her mouth than she expected. Ethan glanced at her, searching her expression for something he could not quite place, a flicker of hesitation that did not match the practical tone of her voice. "Nora," he said gently, "is something wrong?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly, and stood to refill her glass, though it was already nearly full. It was in that small unnecessary movement that she understood with startling clarity that the discomfort she felt was not about the rumors ending, it was about him leaving. Somewhere in the quiet ordinariness of shared breakfasts and borrowed jackets and small unspoken kindnesses, she had stopped thinking of Ethan Holloway as a stranger she was using to protect her image and started thinking of him as someone she genuinely did not want to lose. That realization frightened her more than any headline ever had. Nora had built her entire adult life around control, around never needing anyone enough that their absence could destabilize her. And yet, here she was, standing on a balcony with a full glass of wine she did not want, terrified of a man walking out of a hotel room and simply not coming back. She turned toward him, and for the first time since they had met, her carefully composed expression slipped entirely, revealing something raw and uncertain beneath it. "What if I don't want it to end yet?" she said quietly, the words escaping before she had fully decided to say them. Ethan rose slowly from his chair, closing the distance between them with unhurried steps, as though he understood this moment required patience rather than urgency. He did not touch her, not yet, only stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him against the cold evening air. "Then it doesn't have to end," he said softly. "Not until you're ready." Nora looked up at him, something shifting behind her eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them saying far more than either was prepared to voice aloud. "I spent 8 years telling myself I was finished with all of this," Ethan admitted, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were confessing something to himself as much as to her. Not just the buildings, all of it. Letting someone close enough to matter. Waking up and wondering how someone else's day went. Worrying whether they made it home safe in weather like this. He gestured faintly toward the rain streaking the glass behind them. "I told myself I had already had my chance at that and it would be greedy to want another one." Nora felt something catch in her throat, unfamiliar and sharp. "And now?" she asked. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Now I'm standing on a balcony with a woman I met 3 weeks ago, and I can't remember the last time not wanting to leave a room felt this complicated." 2 nights later, at a formal dinner celebrating the opening of a new Ashford property downtown, Nora reached for Ethan's hand without thinking, her fingers lacing through his in front of dozens of investors, executives, and at least one photographer who had been quietly documenting their public appearances for weeks. It was not a performance. Both of them understood that immediately. The way her grip tightened slightly rather than staying loose and casual, the way his thumb moved gently across her knuckles in response. Across the room, Mitchell watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, already calculating how he might use the moment against her, unaware that the tenderness in it was no longer something either of them could easily deny, even to themselves. The investigative reporter's article appeared 3 days later under a headline that traveled faster than either of them could have anticipated, declaring in bold print that the CEO of Ashford Hospitality was not in fact married to the man photographed at her side for the past several weeks. The piece was thorough and damning in its detail. Citing marriage records that did not exist, public filings that confirmed Ethan Holloway had never legally wed anyone named Nora Ashford, and speculation from unnamed sources within the company suggesting the entire relationship had been fabricated for reasons that remained unclear. By morning, the story had spread through every financial news outlet that covered the hospitality industry, and Ashford Hospitality stock opened nearly 6% lower than it had closed the previous evening. The board convened an emergency meeting before noon, the tension in the room thick enough that even the most composed executives seemed rattled by the speed of the fallout. Mitchell, seated near the head of the table, wasted no time framing the crisis in the most damaging light possible, suggesting that a CEO willing to deceive the public about something as basic as her marital status could not be trusted to lead honestly on matters that actually affected shareholders. Several board members nodded along, their concern for the company's reputation genuine, even if Mitchell's motives were less pure. They demanded in no uncertain terms that Nora address the public and explain herself before the story spiraled any further out of the company's control. Nora sat at the far end of the table, her expression unreadable, listening to a room full of people debate her private life as though it were a line item on a quarterly report. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the storm gathering around her. "I understand the concern," she said, "and I will address it. But I will do it on my own terms, in my own time, and I will not be lectured about honesty by people who have spent the last month digging through a private citizen's finances hoping to find a scandal that didn't exist." The room fell silent. Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but something in her expression stopped him. "I will speak publicly by the end of the week," Nora continued. "I will explain everything, but I need that time, and I expect this board to grant it to me." She left the meeting that afternoon carrying a weight she had never quite felt before, the sense that whatever she said next would not only determine the fate of her company but would also force her to admit publicly feelings she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge privately. She found Ethan waiting outside the building, having heard about the article that morning and come straight there without calling ahead. He did not ask what had happened in the meeting. He simply opened the car door for her, the same small gesture he had offered 100 times over the past few weeks, and said only, "Whatever you decide to say, I'll be standing beside you when you say it." Nora looked at him for a long moment, something steadying in her chest despite the chaos surrounding them both, and nodded once before stepping into the car. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon in a hotel ballroom crowded with reporters, cameras, and executives from Ashford Hospitality standing tents along the back wall. Nora had spent the morning rehearsing a careful statement with her communications team. Language designed to protect the company's stock price while offering just enough truth to satisfy the growing curiosity surrounding her personal life. But as she stood backstage minutes before walking out, the prepared words felt hollow in her mouth, insufficient for everything that had actually happened over the past several weeks. It was Ethan who stepped out first before anyone expected him to. Walking directly to the podium while Nora watched from the wings, startled by his sudden appearance,